Hello and welcome to today's India Branch webinar. My name is Julie and I'm part of the team here at IIRSM. I'd like to welcome today our speaker, John Perez, who is an independent consultant and the chair of the Europe branch. And John will be speaking about safety culture, why one size does not fit all. Okay, over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Julie. As you see on the slide, there's the title, but there's a little statement at the bottom just saying, how would you describe the culture in your country? I haven't said India, just in case there are more people than just from India in this particular webinar. But I do also want to test using the chat. So if people would like to add a few comments, start adding a few things, how would you describe the culture in your country? Just to see if you can get warmed up. Hopefully we get a few in there.
Nothing yet, John. If you just wiggle your mouse, you can see the chat bubble. If you just want to press on that and pop a message for John.
Okay, so Manish Kumar has raised his hand. I don't know if...
Let's have a look. I always put the hand down now, so... Okay, doesn't look to be anybody's popped a message in yet, okay, John, but it is working.
Okay, so I'll move on rather than wait here for a while, but please add to that if something occurs to you. Any one word, two words. Just very interested to hear particularly about India. One of the things I'm going to introduce myself, but one of the companies I was working for, or the company I worked for last, was called Givaudan. And we had a number of sites in India. So we had offices in Mumbai and Bangalore, and we had sites in Daman, Pune, Roha, and Jigani as well. So we had quite a number of factories. And one thing that always impressed me was it was without doubt one of the strongest safety cultures we had in the company on all four of those sites, those manufacturing sites. There was something about the way the business was run in India. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the culture program that we rolled out. But I feel a little bit hesitant talking to the India branch because I'm also hoping that I learned something from you, because I think there seemed to be something in the business I worked for that was almost magical about India in the way they manage safety. I particularly remember a time talking to our site manager at the Jigani site, and I was sat in his office. So I'm the senior safety guy from head office, coming to the site to talk to him, and then he said, "I'm sorry, I'm going to have to end the meeting. We can always start again later, but it's the birthday of one of my employees, and we always have coffee and cake on people's birthdays, and it gives them at least one time in a year where they can have a one-to-one with the site manager and say anything they want to say." And that really struck me as something really positive, and maybe start to indicate why the culture was so good there. And I think the leadership style of, he was leading his people. He wasn't managing the senior guy, not managing upwards, the senior guy from head office. He was leading his people and putting them first. And I think that is really one of the key factors in this. And we'll come to that later. So maybe that helps helps you reflect on what is the culture. I see semi-matured from Manish in the chat, but maybe it helps you also start to reflect on what sort of culture you have in your country, but also on the sites where you work. So if I introduce myself, let's go to the controls. So this is a couple of things about me. I studied engineering at university, but I moved into HR, and then operations, and then EHS. So I've had quite a varied career, and I've worked in Unilever, big international, ICI, which doesn't actually exist anymore, but was a big British chemical conglomerate. And then I moved into Givaudan, which is a Swiss company, mostly making flavor and fragrances. And I'm now a self-employed consultant. And a couple of achievements, I suppose. The picture on the left is our factory in Hungary. And I was the project leader for this. So this is one of the big achievements, helping the company spend 170 million Swiss francs building this factory, this production facility, which is now their biggest globally. So obviously, I didn't do it on my own. Had a big team working on that. But also one of the key factors was, how do you set up the right safety culture from the very beginning? And this idea of culture has always been interesting to me, has always inspired me in all of the roles that I've done. And in my personal life, I'm married. I have 3 children and 2 grandchildren. And the picture you see on the right there is me in my sporting life. I was an ultra marathon runner, and this is when I won the Commonwealth Championship in 2011. This was a 24-hour running. So this is how far can you go in 24 hours. So a pretty crazy sport. I represented Wales and so won that particular championship. I'm quite happy talking to an Indian audience, because you know what the Commonwealth Championship is. When I talk to a Swiss audience, they're a bit confused. It doesn't really mean anything to them. So a little bit about my sort of professional and in personal life. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to do a little bit about what I mean by safety culture, maybe different from what you mean. I'm going to look at some of the differences in observed culture. I may not fully answer that question or that comment in the title about why one size doesn't fit all, but we will get into a little bit of that. I'm going to talk about the implementation that we did in Givaudan, so a little bit of our practical experience, a look at how leaders influence culture, and then some of the critical success factors. Hopefully I can get through all of that in the time we have. I'll keep an eye on the clock. And please ask questions as you go, use the chat or put your hand up, and Julie will manage the questions, and we'll deal with those as we go. I have to show this. Everybody shows an iceberg when they're talking about culture. It's a bit of a cliche, but it does express it well. So what we see going on in businesses, in organizations, is the behavior. The visible bit is the behavior. It's not the culture, but it's a pretty good indicator of culture. The culture is a bit deeper under the surface, and we'll get into a little bit more about what that means. And obviously, culture influences behavior. And then deeper still are the beliefs and values in the business. The arrows are two-way, because you can also, by changing behavior, start to affect the culture. If a leader starts talking to people about safety, which is a behavior, it starts to create a culture of safety in a small way. So behavior can influence culture, and culture change can influence beliefs and values. Maybe people move from thinking, safety is not so important, to something that's a deeply held value because of what happens in their workplace. So mostly the beliefs and values don't change very much, but they can be altered as well. So that's the classic iceberg model. We use this image quite a lot, and I like it. It's something that I came up with a few years ago about this 3-legged stool. And I use this because you can only sit on this stool safely if all the legs are the same length and they're all nice and solid. And the 3 legs that I used to talk about, or do talk about, are technology. So the equipment that you have, the plant and equipment, the systems and procedures, like your health and safety management system, and then culture and behavior. I'm going to just talk about culture and behavior today. It doesn't mean the other things are not important. All 3 of these things are equally important. But this is not about technology and systems and procedures. It's about culture. And I flag up one particular important bit there about leadership behavior is a critical component. Sometimes when we talk about behavioral safety, the leaders kind of think we're talking about them, the others, the workers. But actually, we're also talking about the leaders. We're especially talking about the leaders and their behavior, which has a huge impact here. Obviously, the culture has, there's an overlap. How people use the technology is related to the culture and behavior. Whether people follow procedures, how the management team write the procedures, depends on the culture as well. So So there is a big overlap there. I came up with one example that might illustrate this point. For example, you could have a rule which comes under systems and procedures. And this is a kind of real example from my experience. So you must use the correct tool for the job is a good rule to have. But what happens if you don't have the correct tool for the job? Well, in a positive culture, I would say there is a dialogue between the worker and the leader, which results in the correct tool being found or purchased. Alternatively, risk assessment could be done to find a safe method while a tool is ordered if you don't have the right one. And the leader sees it as their responsibility to ensure that the worker has the correct tool. So the outcome could be a slight delay, but a safe system of work is restored and the positive culture is reinforced. So that's something like I would say is a positive example. In a poor safety culture, I would say the worker is expected to manage without the tool. If the leader is asked, they say, "Oh, can't you use your initiative? Come up with something." And the outcome in the best case is the rule is no longer a rule because it doesn't apply all the time. The safety culture is undermined and the risk of injury is increased. Worst case is all of that plus there is an injury. So this is why I talk about the overlap, and this is how culture affects procedure and vice versa. So hopefully that gives a good example. One of the other things that I'm a big proponent of and really support is something called human and organization performance. I'm a practitioner for this topic. And it's something, again, we've looked at a lot in how this affects or how we affect behavior, how we affect leadership, how we affect culture. And a couple of very simple points from that is around human error. So there's an old view where human error is the cause of many incidents, and you could have a culture where you fix the person. And what does that mean? That means if they do something wrong, you could discipline them, you could dismiss them. Maybe it's retraining, but the problem is the worker. So we have to do something to the worker to stop the error happening again. In HOP, human and organization performance, we'd say that human error is systematically connected to the feature of people's tools, tasks, and operating environment. So their working environment. And this then comes down to fixing the context, and not the worker. So making sure they are working in a good environment, they have the right tools, the right level of leadership. And this is about the culture. So do you have a culture where you fix the person, which tends to drive you towards a more negative safety culture? Or do you have a culture where the go-to is to fix the context, and that drives you in a more positive direction because people feel safe, not just physically safe, but psychologically safe. So if we do it properly, we can create a learning culture. So if I make a mistake, I need to share it so we can learn why it happened and reduce the chance of a similar error in future. Which is very different from the left-hand side, which might be, if I make a mistake, I will get fired. So I'm going to hide my mistakes, and then we don't learn. So just sort of flag that up as one of the aspects of creating a very positive culture. Okay, so having done that, we can say that everyone wants to be safe. We know that. No one wants to get hurt. So if we define and implement a great safety culture, we've solved the problem. So what do you think? I'm guessing that most people, please feel free to use the chat, but I'm guessing most people don't see it as that simple. That the safety culture isn't just something you order from Amazon or whoever, you put it in place and you solve your problem. It's a bit more complicated than that. So I'll start looking at some of the differences and maybe how you influence that. I'm just seeing the chat, yeah, but the recording can be uploaded. I'm happy to share it, so no problem with that. So I'm going to ask a few questions. Please feel free to put in the chat. It would be nice if it was interactive, but I'm not going to slow down too much because we have quite a bit to get through. But it would be great if people can put some comments in there. So first of all, if you look at the top left, This is an example of attitudes to rules, and we spoke about rules before. And this is a way of looking at the culture is, how do people, what is people's attitude towards rules? How do they behave when they're confronted with a rule? Because this can give you a really good indication of what sort of culture you have. And sometimes it's based on national cultures. This is a generalization because there isn't one size fits all. Not everybody in one country has the same culture, not every organization. But there are some things that kind of show up as common factors. So if you look at the top left here, my statement says, we'll challenge, but once the rule is agreed, we will follow it. So any thoughts on what country that sort of statement would come from? Does anyone have experience of this? And if any of these you think apply to India, please say so. Be interested to hear that. But yeah, please type into the chat your guesses. So I'm going to move through, and I'm going to go down the left side and then the right side. But please feel free to put in. Okay. So someone's put in China for the first one. Well, my experience, I think that might be from Julie, but my experience is actually this one. And I particularly remember back in the days when Britain was in the EU, we used to get a lot of complaints from other member states about why we were so difficult in challenging all of the rules, in delaying them and causing them to be modified before they get implemented. And that was because we always followed the rules. Whereas some other countries, they would say, well, you just say yes, and then you don't do it. And then it's, you don't have to struggle so hard. So this was one of the things I experienced. And the second one, don't give me rules, tell me what the risk is, and I will make my own decisions, was actually my experience of Switzerland, which is where I live at the moment. And this really struck me when I moved from one country to another. And that is often how cultures show up. You're not aware of your own culture very much until you move into another environment and think, oh, wow, this is different. And it highlights what things were like before. So what I saw when I moved to Switzerland was I was quite surprised, because my prejudice was that I thought the German-speaking countries were very strong on rules and following rules. It turned out that it wasn't quite as simple as that. And I know with a lot of Swiss people, they like to make their own decisions. So explain the risks and I will decide what's best. And there are pros and cons to these first two. So for example, the UK one means if you follow the rules, if the rules defined properly, you keep people safe because they follow the rules. It's not always the case. I'm sure Julie would say that as well, but in general, we're quite good at following the rules. However, it doesn't encourage responsibility. So if something goes wrong, it must be someone else's fault because they didn't do the rule properly or it wasn't enforced properly. And the Swiss one is kind of the opposite. So it encourages personal responsibility. I will think about this and I will make my own decisions. But the problem is they can make the wrong decisions and do something that causes themselves an injury. So there are always pros and cons to different cultures. The bottom left one is something, and I'm not sure this is 100% correct, but it's something I've observed from some of the work I've done in North America. And this is something that highlighted to me in the USA. So this is a country where I've heard more than ever, where one employee might say to management about another employee that they should be disciplined. You should not let them get away with that, or even they should be dismissed because they can't be safe. And that is employees really putting a big emphasis on line management to say, you need to manage this. You need to manage other people's behavior. Please continue to add things in the chat if you want, but top right then, rules should be flexible. I will use my intelligence to decide if I can ignore them. Again, I was a bit surprised by the German-speaking world, but it wasn't my expectation. But I think there is something there about promoting people's brain power and thoughts and knowledge and experience. And therefore people are expected to use that. So if they can find a solution, so in my example before, if they don't have the right tool for the job, it's part of the culture that I'm a clever person and I can find an alternative solution that works. So therefore I don't need to follow the rule because I can find a good way to do it. And then the second one down there, guidelines are enough. I'll decide how to work within them. Is something I noticed with one of their neighbors in the Netherlands. So, they didn't want rules, they wanted guidelines. Again, there's something there about who I am as a person and that I know what's best. And I can figure out what's best. So please don't give me rules. Just give me some guidelines so I know where the boundaries are. And then the bottom one, to come back to Julie's comment, this is something I noticed in China in particular. I want clear rules so I know exactly what I can and can't do. So we saw some conflict in a recent meeting we had between these two on the bottom right, because somebody saying we just need guidelines, someone else saying no, we want rules. If you call it a guideline, that means we don't have to follow it. The rules need to be very clear. So it's fascinating when you get into this and you see these different things popping up. I do stress these are generalizations. Not everybody behaves the same way in a country. There are obviously differences. Hopefully that gives you some insight into this. There are other things that show up as well that are not so much about national cultures, but I've seen as differences on sites. So the top left, my colleagues are like my family. I want to keep them safe. I mean, that does kind of come up a lot more in Latin America. That this is why safety is important, because my colleagues are like my family. It comes across very strong. Sometimes you see this, safety is important because the boss says it is important. So there's an implied there that I don't really believe it, but the boss says do it, so I'm going to do it. You could have a very negative, psychologically unsafe culture. If I don't behave safely, I'll lose my job. Can also drive the right behavior, but it's not necessarily the culture you want. On the other hand, there is always a line, because if people can't behave safely, then maybe they shouldn't be working here, but you should give them the chance to change. Safety is important because we need to hit our safety KPI targets. Some organizations, some sites are very numbers driven, and sometimes the KPI has more importance than the reason it's there, which is to keep people, it's to measure if we're keeping people safe. We must be safe, otherwise the government will close us down. So this is this is based on a very sort of authoritarian system where there are constant checks and you have to follow the rules, otherwise you can't operate. And then bottom right, it's obvious. Nobody should ever get hurt at work. So, this is one where people really feel it. This is where it's one of those deeply held values and beliefs that you get. So this is then why starting to indicate why one size doesn't fit all, because if you go for the rules in a country where guidelines are important, or vice versa, it's not going to work. And if you have a culture where people treat each other like family, and you're trying to put in something that says we're going to discipline people if they don't follow the rules, you can kind of get some conflict. Some of the other things that showed up in the work, just to quickly flag up a few points that I've noticed. I see this sort of difference between positivity and negativity. Some people are just more negative than others. So sometimes it really feels like, oh, great, this a new idea, let's give it a go. And then the negativity is, oh, we don't need anything new, just leave us be. We don't like that, we don't want it. And some sites, groups are just like that, and you get either the very positive or the very negative. Similar with optimistic and pessimistic. The one that says, oh, this is going to make a fabulous difference, this is really good, we're going to change, it's going to be better, compared to just saying, oh, this will never work. And also easy versus difficult. in my sort of travels around the world, I've really noticed that in some cultures, it's really, really easy to get things done. If you say, oh, why don't we do this? It happens. In other cultures, it's just really hard, really difficult. And I've said curious versus resistant. So curious means, oh, this looks good. Why don't we try it? Yeah. Why don't we give it a go? Compared to, what we've got is fine. We don't need something new. This works. And you have to deal with all of these things when you're working on culture. And, if you want to change something, if you see the need for change, you really want these things on the left-hand side, not the things on the right-hand side. The bottom one, I think, really stands out for me is our tendency to trust. Trust is so important in safety culture. People need to trust their company, trust their leadership. But in some cultures, the first position is, I'm not going to trust anybody until I have a good reason to trust them. In other cultures, you have the opposite, which is, I will trust until I have a good reason not to trust. And this is quite a different attitude to trying to change something. If you try and change something and there's a tendency to distrust, then it's really hard work. So I've noticed quite a lot of these differences, but we're really, we're hoping for the things on the left. But if we don't have them, then we have to work with what's in front of us. So I'm going to go through this example from my previous employer just to tell you a little bit about the process we had. So, to use another cliche, I used the iceberg before. You need to know where you're going, and you need to know where to start. And I put up this quote first, so please take a second to read it. This is from Alice in Wonderland, which is a very famous book and a famous movie. And it's when Alice meets the Cheshire Cat, and she says, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" And the cat says, "That depends a good deal on where you want to get to." And Alice says, "I don't much care where." And then it doesn't matter which way you go. So I kind of like it as a bit of a fun sort of part of the book. But it really makes the point. You need to know where you're going. Otherwise, there's no point in setting out a plan. If you don't know where you're going, you could have any plan really. So you need to understand where you're going. And conversely, on the other side, you need to know where to start. And there's in Britain, we have Irish jokes, and it's maybe not very politically correct to say talk about Irish jokes these days, but my favorite one is the tourist who stops to ask for directions and says, "How do you get to Kerry?" And the person he asks says, "Well, I wouldn't start from here." And of course, you have no choice but to start from here, because that's where you are. So the starting point is always where you are now. Yes, it would be nice if we were somewhere better, because then it would be easier to start, but we're not, we're here. So the first thing is to actually understand where here is. And it's not always clear with culture exactly where you are. Sometimes some of the things you observe are not really truly indicative of the culture. So you need to dig a bit to understand. But the only place you can start from is here, within the current culture, and with all of the issues and problems and difficulties that you want to move away from. But you have to start within that culture before you can move on. So what we did was, the first thing was to decide where we wanted to be. And what we did in the business was actually do some investigation, and we asked people, what are the best safety cultures we have in the company? Now, the company I was working for didn't really like off-the-shelf solutions, and I tend to agree with this, that you have to work within your own culture, and buying something that somebody offers off the shelf and saying, "Go and implement this," is not really going to work. It might do, but probably not. So we decided we were going to come up with something ourselves. So we said, what are the best cultures we had? And these were two sites in the UK and in Mexico that were highlighted as the best examples. So we did some interviews there. We interviewed top down, all functions, to get a view, what do people say about this great culture? And we then tested it on 5 other sites, and you can see Japan, China, Netherlands, Switzerland, USA, to say, does this work everywhere? And we came up with a set of statements that people were saying. These were the really positive things they were saying about their site. And we picked sites that, the 5 that we tested on were either really good or improving in those countries, improving dramatically. So we were looking for the positives, and we came up with a set of statements that defined what a really good safety culture looked like. And one of the things that we were then able to do was group them into 12 different domains, we called them, in under 3 different group headings. But one of the things that really stood out for me was not all of them were about safety. It's very difficult to separate the culture overall from the safety culture. And we were able to bring in elements of other things that, if you can improve this, it will improve safety. And you kind of have to have a bit of faith that that will deliver. But this is what was being said by all of the employees, from the site head down to the shop floor on these sites, and in offices, factory, labs, all different work environments. So these were the 12 domains we came up with, and we put them in these 3 groups: inspire, engage, and enable. So inspire was much more about, you can see like leadership is in here. How do you motivate people to do the right thing? What is the overall culture and mindset of people, culture and values of the site? What sort of mindset do people have? Do they want to learn, or do they just want to do the job and go home? These sort of things. Engaging is really about how you involve people. Do you just tell them what to do, or do you really involve all of your workforce? Then enable is more about the systems and procedures and how they work within the culture. So having said culture is different from systems and procedures, you see it appear here, but this is really about how people engage with the systems. Do they follow the rules? Do the leadership involve people when they're creating operating procedures, for example? Do you involve the person doing the job, who is really the expert in that job? So these things were the headings that we would then go and assess. I'm just going to skip over that, a bit more explanation. So we then came up with this process for each site, where the first step was we would do an employee survey anonymously, and that would give us insights into strengths and weaknesses on the site based on those domains. And I'll show you what's in some of those domains in a minute. We then ran a workshop with the leadership team, as this team is critical to success. It's critical to implementing the change, or deciding on the direction of change. One of the things I found a really good indicator of culture is who turns up to the leadership workshop. So you invite the leadership team and the heads of department, but for example, if some people don't turn up because it's not important, or something else is more important, it gives you an idea of what the culture is on that site, or the attitude to safety. So at the very start, just who's there gives you an indicator of what you're up against. We then do a maturity assessment, and that's part of understanding where you are right now, so where you're going to move from. And this is important because if you try and, I've been in a situation where people say, what's the best practice? Let's just do that. And if you try and run to the end, it doesn't work. You have to go one step at a time. You can't jump straight to the end. So it really is important to know where you are now. It's not about having a league table. It's that real solid understanding of where to start from. You then come up with an action plan, and then follow up, and hopefully then we repeat it, a few years down the road. So this is the process we said we would do for all of our operation sites, and we've started this implementation. One of the key things I always stress is building on strengths, and you see that bottom left. It's not just about where are the gaps and fixing them. All sites have strengths, and if the strength isn't in safety, is it in another area that you can use to build on? For example, if they're really good at training and development, can you use that to improve safety? So it is also about building on strengths. It's not an audit where you just tell people kind of which bits are non-compliant. And also it's really critical to get the buy-in of the full leadership team and to have them be accountable. Otherwise it won't work. So how you develop that action plan is important. Okay, so if you look at the survey, just to give you an idea of the results, we get this sort of thing. Here's an example. So the green is really positive or positive, and the red is really negative or negative. And you can see the relative size of those bars give you an indication at a sort of macro level where the strengths and weaknesses are. So you can see in this example, the goals and KPIs one is the biggest positive, followed by reporting and leadership. And for me, when we saw this, it means that it gives us a lot of hope, because leadership is one of the most positive. So people on site are not saying the leadership here is terrible. The people on site have faith in their leadership. So that means that when the leadership try and change something, they will be trusted to deliver it. So this was a really important one. So this is the sort of information you can get from this. And then you look on the most negative, and you've got teamwork and training and development. In this particular case, the training and development was about a high turnover. This was post-COVID, and a lot of people deciding they wanted to do something else with their lives, difficulties recruiting. And there was a problem with a lot of new starters who really didn't know how to do the job properly, and this needed to be solved. Because that's also part of the culture, that you make sure people know how to keep themselves safe when they join the business, or you just say, get on with the job, you'll be fine. And then teamwork is another one, which was a bit of an alarm bell for me, because I think teamwork is one of the factors that has the most impact on culture. Teams look after each other. So this is something that needed to be worked on. And it was mostly about how we work between teams. Do we work in silos? Just to dig a little bit deeper, we covered, and please don't read all of this, but these are some of the statements that came up that were in the survey. And so the statements are all positive. And do we feel this in a positive way? Do we, or do we think this never happens? Does it always happen, or does it never happen? And what we see are some of the things that are the strengths we can build on. But one of the things to notice is most of the most positive ones were in this inspire section, and a lot about leadership, which is great. And then some of them were enable, but there were none at all in the engage section. So again, this kind of flags up maybe the issue on this site is the way in which you engage your workforce in making improvements. And sure enough, when we go to the negative statements, the most negative, there's none in enable, but there's a lot within engage. So this is already telling us this particular grouping, this is where we need to put some attention. So we really need to engage with our workers in a much better way. And some of that was about, pressure, it was about the staff turnover, it was about people being under pressure because of, employees who'd left and not yet been replaced. So they're so focused on their own job, they're not working with the others. So it really starts to indicate some of the things we can improve. And these things, obviously introduce safety risk. You can also look at functions, departments. So these are the curves across the domains, and you can see the functions on the right. So you can see, for example, the orange line is quite low on this black line. So the black line is finance and controlling. The orange one is engineering and maintenance. And the green one at the top, EHS, they were the most positive people about the culture. And you may say that's not surprising, but sometimes it's the other way around, because sometimes the environment, health and safety people are the ones who see all the problems and they rate it low. And then you see some outliers that you can really work on. So if you look here on the yellow one and the high point and quality, the quality team were really positive about their leadership. So this can really give the leader there a lot of sort of positive feelings about what they're doing and how it's working. Other things that stood out for me was this orange one here at the bottom of training and development. This is engineering and maintenance. So these are your knowledge workers. These are the people who are working on non-standard tasks, working with permits to work, managing risk on a daily basis, and they don't feel properly trained. So again, this is a big alarm bell that says we need to solve this problem, because otherwise, we are introducing risk. And then finance and controlling, really low on communication information. Not sure why that is, but it's, again, these outliers are all worth investigating. And sometimes we see big differences between functions. There's a clear gap between the most positive and the least positive. We also looked at level, and this is a fascinating one for me, and this is really typical, is that in almost all areas, the supervisor group is the lowest. And for me, this is a group that's kind of stuck in the middle. They have all the pressure from underneath, because all of the people they're leading have demands about, they want shift pattern changes, they want training, they need this to improve, they need this tool, they need this system. And at the same time, they have all the pressure from above about hitting the targets, getting the output, and they get squeezed in the middle. And we often really underinvest in this group. So I think this is what shows up in this sort of chart. And I think at the same time, one of the things we often see from the leadership workshop is they decide they need to spend more time with their frontline workers, and they bypass the supervisors, and it makes this one worse. So I'd really flag that up as a watch out. Make sure you work with your supervisors in the right way. There are also a lot of comments, and this is real gold dust. When people actually take the time to write something rather than just ticking a box of good or bad, they actually write something. And you get, typically, the positives are very general, and then you get some negatives that are more specific. And I think, again, there's a full range of sort of topics in here, but the way that the leadership team engages with these is really critical. Because it's quite hard to listen to this and read this when it's about your site. But this is, these are the real things that you need to tackle, and how you then respond to it, how you tackle it, how you engage with this is really critical to moving the culture forward. So again, these are just some examples of things that came up. I'm going to click through fairly quickly. This is the maturity model we had. So we were talking about assessing the maturity, and we came up with something again in-house where we use this bridging model. There's lots of different analogies you can use. We decided on this one that first of all, you have a gap, and your level one is the discovery, is knowing, kind of feeling there's a gap, but not really knowing what to do about it. Then you need to build a foundation, a solid foundation that you can work on. So putting really putting the basics in place. 3 is then building that bridge. So building on your foundation and really getting things really functioning well, and filling some of the gaps. And then finally, the excellence level, when you have the bridge. So everything is in place to a high level. You're doing the maintenance, you're improving, you're refreshing it. You're making sure all of your new starters are taken across this bridge in the same way as your more experienced employees. So it's about getting everybody across the bridge as well. So we use this model, and we got the sites to assess from the survey what level they were at, and also where they wanted to aim at next. Okay, so then we get into action planning. But one of the things we did was we kind of did a bit of training for the leadership team, because we realized not everybody knows exactly what it is they need to work on next. So we wanted to get a sort of basic level up, make sure people in the right position. So we looked a little bit at the theory about influencing behavior. We also then looked at the practice, because whereas there are differences in leadership, you also have people in these jobs who are there because they deserve to be there. They have experience, they have knowledge. So what's worked for them? They are all leaders who've done some of this before. And then looking at some of the traps, beware of the traps, but also be aware of the traps, and don't fall into them. So that was the kind of next part. I realize I've been over ambitious on the time, and we did set up a little poll, but it's probably going to take about 15 minutes to run it. So I think what I'll do is I'll skip through and not actually run the poll. So Julie, we don't need that one, but I'll go straight to the answers because I think that also highlights some of the things that would come out of that. So I was going to get you to rank these, but here's the answer. This work is from a guy called Ed Schein, who was at MIT and did a lot of work on how leaders influence behavior. And one of the fascinating things that came out of this was, these are in order. So number 1 under the primary determinants is the most important. Number 6 under the secondary one is the least important, but they are all important. None of them are unimportant. It's just different levels. And what you notice is on the right-hand side, the secondary ones are some of the more structural things, like the design and structure of the organization. So it's slightly wrong sentence there, but it's the organization and job design and structure, the systems and procedures, the design of the physical workplace. These are all important. But actually what's more important is what's on the left. And what leaders pay attention to, measure, and control on a regular basis. That's because if the lead, let's go back to rules again, which would come on the right-hand side, systems and procedures. If the leader says, oh, it doesn't matter, you don't have to follow the rule, if they don't follow the rule themselves, then you don't get the behavior of following the rule, because even though it's there and it needs to be there, people see it's not important because our leader doesn't pay attention to it. And that's why a number of these statements begin with the word observed, because what people see is what drives their behavior. So we did a lot of work with this with the leaders, because we really wanted them to understand that when they came to the actions, they needed to do the things that make the most difference. So we didn't want a load of actions that said, write a new procedure, come up with a new mission statement. Let's have a website statement on our, statement on our website saying how important this is. No, it's about what you do as leaders. So go out there and walk the talk. It's a fairly obvious thing, but I go back to my example at the beginning from one of our sites in India about the leader who got coffee and cake for all of his employees at least once a year. He was sending a very clear message. What they were observing was that I am important. The people here are important to the leader. And that makes a big difference. So that very much comes in on the left-hand side. So I'm sorry to rush through that a little bit, just conscious of the time, but hopefully it's relatively clear. We then looked at the leaders themselves. We said, what worked for you? As I said before, they're there for a reason. They have good experience. You don't get appointed to a leadership position unless you have knowledge, skills, and experience. So what worked for you? And importantly, what didn't work? Or do you have examples from observing others of the things that didn't work? And only after that did we then come up with the actions for that site. And the actions were always very unique. But we then talked to them about how not to influence. So having come up with actions, how are you going to deliver those? Because the how is really important. And we looked at some of these topics as well. So you have the picture of the trap, and that's there for a good reason. So you saw on the previous one, this one, what leaders pay attention to, measure, and control on a regular basis. The most important thing. But then on this one, paying attention to, measuring, and controlling the wrong things, because then you'll get the wrong behavior. If you really put loads of attention into your KPIs and not your people, then maybe you give the message that the KPI is important, but actually the people are not so important. When there is an incident, and you saw that statement about responding to critical incidents, when there is an injury, do you say, who screwed up and how quickly can we start up again? Very clear message about what's important. Or do you actually say, is everybody okay? Can I help? What do you need? It's a very different leadership response. A person I was working with in Coca-Cola used this phrase a lot: when the words and music don't match, you have this discord. So if the leadership say one thing and they do another, then there's something wrong, and that confuses people at the very least. Poorly designed bonus schemes, if you're rewarding people for the wrong thing, then you're going to get that wrong thing all the time. And it may sound like a stupid example, but it happens. It definitely happens. Not deliberately, it's usually an unintended consequence, which I mentioned at the bottom. What if you promote the employee who doesn't follow the safety rules? Now, so you keep saying safety is our most important thing. This is really important. We won't compromise. And then you find that, there's a vacancy for a supervisor, and you promote one of your operators who doesn't behave safely. And it sends a very clear message. Actually, this is not important. There's something else that's more important. And conversely, if you actually fire the employee who tried hard but made a mistake, then this also sends a very clear message that we mustn't make mistakes. So I'm not going to admit to any mistakes, and you stop learning. So there's some very clear traps that you can fall into here. And we looked at some work. This organization, Gallup, have done a lot of polls over the years. And these are some of the things that they highlighted as the 4 key risks to a thriving culture. So how to get this wrong? The risk, one of them is employee mental health. This really significant and topical in the last few years. And one way to solve this is working on good job and workplace design. So this was the top one on the right-hand side of that previous list. So it's the most important of the structural things. So really making sure you design the job in the workplace well. Another risk is lack of clarity and purpose. So that includes the bit around the leaders making sure that they do the right things and show the right things. Over-reliance on policies, programs, and perks, to paying attention to how you implement and treating employees with respect. So this is moving from the right-hand side to the left of that previous chart. Not just relying on the policy, but how you do it, who do you involve, how do you lead that has a big difference. And then training managers and supervisors. A lot of the time, we don't give the people the leadership skills they need. This is really important, particularly this one around handling feedback and giving feedback. So these are some of the things to avoid, or some solutions you could do to reduce the risk. Another critical success factor for me, then if you go beyond the influence to what are the critical success factors, one of the key ones is trust. And I highly recommend some of the things in this book, Atlas of the Heart by Brené Brown. And she does a whole section on trust. And these are some of the things that come out. And I think I've added a little bit to it as well. But trust comes in different forms. Trust isn't about, I believe you're lying to me. It comes into all of these different forms. So building trust is critical, but understand what sort of trust it is that's missing if you need to replace something. And these are I would say these are the 7 main ones here. And there's simple things like accountability. As a leader, if you make a mistake, just say, sorry, I made a mistake, and fix it as best you can. Then people really get a clear message. They can trust you to be accountable for your own actions. Be reliable, deliver what you say you're going to deliver. Otherwise, people don't trust you. So there's a lot of things in here you can pick up on, but understand which of these it is that you're dealing with. Because sometimes when we say trust, people just think it means the employees think I'm lying to them. It's not as simple as that. I think the second critical success factor, which I've already also related to trust, is this psychological safety. And this is from Timothy Clark. I really like this author in the way he puts it. But to really have a good safety culture, you need people challenging. And some leaders don't like that. You need people challenging in the right way. This is not complaining. This is not moaning. It's properly challenging. But they're only going to do that if they're included. So you move beyond this exclusion stage. So you ask people for their opinions. The learner safety comes from modeling and encouraging and making sure that people who make a mistake are not harmed. They're not criticized, they're not disciplined, but that they're able to speak about the mistake they've made and the learning that came from that. And this creates this learner safety. Then contributors. This means that as a leadership team, you talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it, but you delegate the how we do it. So you encourage your workers to contribute in that way. And then finally, you get to this challenger safety where people can be really open, really honest. Why are you doing it this way? Why don't we find a better way to do this? So this is also a really good model. I do realize I put too much in this presentation. Another critical success factor is the team leaders. I go back to this chart, if you remember this one. And we talk about the thing from Gallup about investing in your leaders, invest in your supervisors. This is one of the most critical things. Invest in this group if you want to have success. Make sure they're properly trained, make sure you involve them, engage with them, make sure they're set up for success and not just sort of stuck in the middle of this sandwich. And definitely do not bypass them and go straight to the shop floor. Work with them. It's their department, it's their team. Teams, I mentioned before as well, teams support each other, teams build trust, and teams keep team members safe. It's one of the most important things, I think, having correct teams that can really work well together. So build teamwork. And then leadership, of course, all of those things I've just mentioned come from good leadership. So, pay attention to this slide and make sure your leaders are doing the right things. And then just to go to the conclusion and say, I'm very sorry I've rushed through this. Hour's gone really quickly. But these are the main things I've learned from this whole process, and hopefully it's something you can pick up on. So understand where you want to go. Start from where you are. Don't try and start from somewhere else. It doesn't work. Engage your supervisors, team leaders. Train your supervisors and team leaders and your top managers. Your top managers don't know everything. They may think they do, but train them as well. Support your supervisors. That means, really support them, be there for them so that they can be successful. Build teams, build trust, and don't just put this point here, don't go for something really huge and unachievable. Just start small. In your next conversation you have with a person in your team, you start building trust. Your very next action is the critical one. Beware of hidden and some more obvious traps and unintended consequences of best intentions, and hold your leaders accountable. So those are the main learnings from that. As I say, sorry, it's a little bit rushed. I really, it's the first time I've done this one. I hadn't really managed the time properly. So I hope it was interesting. I hope it was something that rung a few bells with you, and it might be useful. Does anybody have any questions in the last minute that we have left?
I don't have any questions. If anybody wants to ask a question for John quickly before we go, if you want to use the chat or the Q&A, I'll get John to do some closing thoughts, then we can always come back to questions. But great presentation, John. I'm really impressed the amount of valuable information you managed to cram
Maybe a bit
into an
too
hour.
much.
You can never have too much information. And any closing thoughts you'd like to leave us with, please?
I think a lot of it was there on the conclusions, and I think really this is something really fascinating to engage with. It does make a big difference. It's not just about systems and procedures and technology.
Yeah.
And it's all about people, and really people is what's going to make the difference. So really encourage people to work on this topic.
Great, thank you, John. We've just had a question. I'm not sure you'll be able to answer it in the time given, but Manish has said it's a great presentation. Please, could you share some culture survey models?
So Manish, I see you've got my email there. Maybe if you get in touch and I can share something with you afterwards. But yeah, I can share a bit about our model. We did also look at some of the other models. There's a lot of academics have, so my email is on the screen now. So a lot of academics have really gone into this topic and developed different things. We did use that theory. So people like Hudson, people like the Bradley curve model from DuPont, we use those things as inputs, but we decided not to go with off the shelf because it had to be our culture. How do we make the best of our culture, not how do we implement someone else's culture? But we did use that theory, and there are some things that you can look into. say Hudson is one. I think a lot of people know the Bradley curve, and you Google on those things and you'll find those topics.
Great, thank you, John. We've had another comment in the Q&A saying great presentation. I've just popped your email address in the chat, Manish.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah,
but if you didn't catch it, just email branches@rrsm.org and I can forward your message on. So thank you so much, John, for presenting to the RRSM India branch today, and thank you everyone for attending. I'd like to wish everyone a good afternoon or a good evening wherever you are in the world, and we hope to see you at the next India branch webinar. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye.